Stop watching Fox or CNN or whatever you watch all day. It's fake news.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the latest edition of TRD Talks Live. I'm Erik Engquist, Senior Managing Editor at The Real Deal, and I'm pleased to be joined today by Janno Lieber, the President of MTA Construction and Development. Welcome to all our viewers, and a quick reminder before we get to our show, please go to therealdeal.com to subscribe so that we may continue bringing you these episodes every Wednesday at 5 o'clock. Janno, welcome.
Good to be with you, Erik.
It's great to have you on, not just because the MTA is crucial to the real estate industry, but also because you are a veteran of the real estate industry. So I wonder if you could just very briefly tell our viewers, where you came from, all your years at Silverstein Properties and what you do at the MTA.
Sure. Well, this is my third tour of duty in government. I was in the Koch administration as a kid and worked in the Clinton administration in Washington in the 90s. But in between, I became a real estate professional for a little while and spent 14 years running the Silverstein side of the World Trade Center redevelopment. At the MTA, I'm in charge of the capital program, which, so we have about 2,000 people at MTA working on it. That's a $54 billion capital program, by far the largest program ever. But as Erik is going to get into, it is at risk now because of the financial crisis brought on by the COVID pandemic.
Right, that's the first thing I want to talk about, because 54, I thought it was 51 billion, but it's really nothing until you actually get the money. So what is the status of the funding of that 5-year, $54 billion MTA capital plan?
Well, we started off this year, again, with a high level of confidence about our ability to execute it. The capital program, which is a huge step up from prior capital programs, which were in the $30 to $35 billion range, was funded in large part by the projected revenues from congestion pricing, which the governor and the legislature passed, and by additional taxes, mainly on internet sales and a couple of other real estate taxes, a small slice of real estate, mortgage recording tax, and so on. So we were very optimistic at the beginning of the year. I laid out a plan where we were actually going to commit to $13 billion of new projects just this year. But then COVID hit, and a couple things happened. One is that the Trump administration continued to delay and not take any action on our proposal for congestion pricing, which requires a federal environmental review. I won't get into the details, but they've basically just been sitting on it for over a year. So that put that piece at some risk. And then came the reality that all of those dedicated revenues that were meant to fund the capital program are being impacted by COVID. And then the third challenge to the capital program is that we may have to cannibalize the capital program in order to keep the lights on, to feed the operating budget, just so we can continue to operate the trains and buses and commuter railroads. So all of those things, as Erik suggested, have put the capital program at some risk.
Well,
However,
I
was just going to say we have managed to keep a fair amount of work going, and Erik, if you want me to, I can get into describing some of what we've been doing.
Well, we're going to talk about the projects you have, but just to put it in perspective, I think congestion pricing was maybe $15 billion of the capital program, and then the real estate transfer tax increase, the internet sales, it added up to that was another like 10 billion or so. And then all of the other things that you normally get, as you mentioned, transfer taxes, like all of a sudden real estate transactions just fell off a cliff when COVID hit. So you stopped getting your cut of those. Sales taxes, you get some money from that, I think. That fell off. So how much do you actually have left?
Well, there is a fair amount. A lot of the work that's going on is funded by prior capital programs without getting into all the mechanics. So we've got, during COVID, we managed to keep going 500 projects, 300 of them active construction projects, but most of them had been initiated and were funded in prior capital programs. So all of that work is going on, and we've been able to accelerate a ton of it at the governor's request, finding opportunities to actually get work done faster because of low ridership, hopefully to deliver a better system when the ridership comes back. But the real issue is, Eric, the whole program is dependent, all those revenues that you enumerated support borrowing that allows us to actually spend money on the capital side. That has historically been the MTA's way of funding the capital program. And now, with the uncertainty about the MTA's financial situation, the capital markets have become much less friendly. Our borrowing costs are up by several hundred basis points, and there's a fundamental question of market access. So we don't have access to a ton more money in the capital program unless and until the federal government steps up and does what it would do for any kind of a hurricane or other emergency, and step up and deal with the consequences. We're waiting for Washington to act.
If you have to cannibalize capital funding, what kind of projects would be canceled just to keep the trains running?
Well, we're not ready to, make those decisions. We have done, the homework internally to try to figure out which are the most safety-sensitive projects. We obviously can't put safety at risk. What are the core, what we call state of good repair, the projects that are necessary just to keep the system from falling apart? In the past, people didn't protect those, that basic condition of the system, and it had consequences, as we all know, for how well the trains ran and the system operated generally. So we're going to prioritize safety as well. But let me tell you, the things that we're also trying to do is make sure that we can continue to attack the problem of accessibility, ADA accessibility, which New York's system does not have to the right level, that we're able to install new signals so we can run more trains safely closer together. Those were huge priorities that we don't want to see wiped out by this financial crisis.
Right. There was a whole remaking of the system. New signals was the big one. But I will say that a lot of the stuff was designed to alleviate overcrowding, but now you don't actually have that many passengers. You only have 1.5 million passengers a day, down from 5.5 million. So I would assume that you don't have to run as many trains as you thought. So maybe some of these projects could be pushed back without really any impact on crowding. Is that correct?
Look, I mean, everybody has, I don't have a crystal ball about the exact trajectory of ridership coming back. Obviously, people are expecting, if and when there is a vaccine, there's going to be a significant upsurge in commutation. We've been operating at about 30% of our normal loads. It's not zero. The number of people we carry in the New York City mass transit system is bigger than every other system in the country on its best day. So we're still a big system, and we're getting ready. We're not going to let the system fall apart in anticipation of ridership staying at this 30% level for long. We're going to get ready for resuming normal operations.
One of the reasons that your job is so important is because you have so many stations. I mean, no other system has anywhere near the number of, I think you have 472 stations. And that's a great convenience. It's something we take for granted in this city, that every few blocks you run into another subway station. And that's not the case for other transit systems. But it does present incredible challenges for you in terms of keeping them, all up to date. On accessibility, how much leeway do you have there? I mean, there is a federal law that's been in place for decades, the ADA. Like, how can you just not meet ADA standards at so many of those stations?
Listen, I'm not the lawyer responsible for the whole ADA compliance debate. I'll just tell you that there has been a difference of opinion about whether the federal government's approved plan for us to make accessible the busiest stations was compliance with ADA under the law. But the more important thing is the MTA is committed to maximizing accessibility and making the whole system truly ADA accessible as quickly as we can. That's why we put 70 stations in this current capital program that we're going to be done, along with and in the last couple of weeks, I've opened 6 or 7 different stations, new ADA accessible elevators and otherwise made them accessible. We've really started to pick up steam, and that's why we don't want Washington's indifference and lack of response to cause us to have to contract that key element of the program.
Right.
It's time for, I mean, what I'd say generally, when you look at a subway map, it has these special icons that indicate which stations are accessible. So a disabled person in a wheelchair, for example, has a different system than the rest of us. We should make our system so that it's the same for everybody.
Mm-hmm. Totally agree. And, it was a federal law. So I don't know if that makes it any more or less likely that you can get federal money to pay for a lot of this stuff. But, we really haven't gotten much in the way of infrastructure help from the Trump administration for 4 years. So I think probably the industry is just waiting to see what the outcome of the election is and whether or not you can actually move forward with some real funding. I just want to talk a little bit about things that you can control, or at least would like to control in terms of cost, because whenever the MTA asks for funding, usually the funders come back and say, well, your costs are too high. If you would run a more efficient operation, you'd be able to do more with the funding you have. And I'm hearing great things from the industry about progress that you have made, but it is an enormous task. So could you just give us an update on what you've been able to accomplish so far in terms of cost reductions and efficiency, and what you hope to do still?
So the first thing we want to do is to make the MTA a much better client or customer, so contractors and consultants won't add an MTA premium. So, we've attacked very aggressively the provisions of the MTA contracts that make us different than others and a little one-sided, like the dispute resolution provision that basically says the MTA gets to decide any dispute between the MTA and a contractor. That's not fair, and they charge you for it. We are making sure that we're not requiring them to put more bonding up than necessary, because that eats into their ability to do more projects. And again, they charge you for it. We're really aggressively attacking the timeliness of payments. If you don't pay a contractor on time, they will charge, you are making them your lender, and they will charge you for that. So we've attacked that aggressively. And probably the broadest, one of the biggest things is we're simplifying the designs. The MTA, as many public agencies, has a history of over customization and getting into some arcane specs so that when you go to work for the MTA, you have to, supply a product or a piece of equipment that is weird and not generally available, that's custom. Like the old, if you remember Al Gore showing everybody in the Clinton era that the Pentagon was buying hammers that cost 10 grand because they were all customized. We want to get away from that. So all those things we're doing. The other things we're doing, which are huge, is we are moving to design build. Instead of the MTAs taking years to design projects, handing them over to contractors. The contractors then, there's a lot of disputes about whether the designs are buildable, what's wrong or right with the design. We let the contractor and their design partner do the design, simplify it. It delivers much better speed, much more innovation, because you're giving contractor flexibility. So we're, it's the law of the state of New York, and we're aggressively using design build. The other issue is that whenever we do projects now, we look for opportunities, what we call bundle, which means that if you're going to do a project that requires a track outage or getting in the way of operations in some way, then every other project that requires that interference or that shutdown or outage, we should be looking at as a potential bundle, element of a bundle, so that more work can get done every time you shut down a railroad or a system in some way. And it also, it creates, huge benefits in terms of the speed of operations and also minimizing impact to the customer. So those are some of the things we're doing. Another piece of it is, frankly, at the governor, the legislature's instigation, all of the different MTA agencies were operating separate construction groups. Right. And they brought them all together under my umbrella. And now we have one group which is really all about project management. And those people who are running those projects, we call them project CEOs, now have the power they're responsible for the schedule and the budget of the project, and they don't have to make changes even when someone comes to them and says, change the design, give me a later model, oh, I forgot about this. They have the power to control scope, to control the budget and the schedule in the way that they may not have had it in the past. And that's a new emblem of our approach to project management. It's already yielding results in terms of cost.
That's good to hear, because the MTA has been an infamously siloed agency for years. The tunnels wouldn't talk to the LIRR, wouldn't talk to Metro North, wouldn't talk to New York City Transit, and they each did their own thing. And I'm sure there were a lot of inefficiencies there that resulted from that. And I will tell you that I was talking earlier today with Lou Coletti from the Building Trades Employers Association, who represents the contractors that are hired by the MTA, and he did praise you. He said you've taken a lot of your private sector experience and know-how and sort of brought a different mentality to the MTA. I don't know if you can put that into words, but there is an impression in the industry that the private sector operates differently from the public sector. So has there been any particular change either in culture or in mechanics that you've taken from your work at Silverstein and other places to the MTA?
Yeah, I mean, I would say one thing. One is I watched, when I was at Silverstein and we were rebuilding the World Trade Center, we were doing the office buildings. We were also building public infrastructure for the public sector, mostly for the Port Authority. And I watched how the public sector struggled with procurement and how long it took to actually get jobs started. I also watched how the project cost grew because of what we call the overheads, the markups, bonding, insurance, all the overheads, all the people who were assigned to a project. At the World Trade Center, at Silverstein, I ran the World Trade Center project with somewhere between 5 and 10 people, really, and a couple of them were accountants, and the rest were project managers and construction and design professionals. We tend to overstaff these jobs at the public sector, and we hire outside consultants. And it's more than just extra costs. It dilutes accountability. Mm-hmm. So what we're doing is we're trying to operate much more lean, and also to emphasize, in addition to having a maybe smaller, tighter staff with more accountability, to have a greater emphasis on project duration. Erik, it's counterintuitive. It's not just the contractor's pricing that drives prices up. It's the overheads of the public agencies. And when projects go long, all of those overheads grow. And when we look at big projects that the MTA has done, the length of a project with all of the staff and overheads associated with it was a huge factor. And I'm attacking that as well on some of these big projects.
One of the problems with having too many chefs in the kitchen, of course, is like everyone has to get his own ingredients in there. And so this person has to change, that person has to change, and they all talk about it. And these delays just build up. I'm sure that had a lot to do with why things took so long, change orders, and it just seemed like you just needed more and more money for every project. I want to talk about some specific projects, but before we get to that, before I forget, you don't have a lot of contractors to choose from relative to the size of your agency, because there were a lot who didn't want to work with the MTA, and then there were very few that had the capability to do some of these huge projects that you want. So when you only have 2 or 3 bidders for, obviously they're going to bid more. Because they know that they're going to win every, 33% of the bids if there are only 3 bidders. So they bid more. Have you been successful at all in attracting more contractors?
Look, I mean, I think that first thing to be borne in mind is that the MTA work is not generic construction. It's not, stick-built residential construction, which, can be done by all different kinds of construction organizations. It's pretty complicated. You need to know how railroad systems works, and that includes all the communication systems and the safety systems and so on. You need to know how to operate in an operating railroad environment in many cases. So what we're doing is we are trying to, before COVID started to complicate things, is we were actually going out and finding worldwide railroad construction organizations who had, for whatever reason, not come to New York, who felt the MTA, even though they were railroad professionals, was too complicated, or they didn't want to work in New York for whatever set of reasons. So we were being very targeted and going out and finding them. And we were starting to have some success. It's way, way, way too early to say, to declare victory, Eric. We were just getting started. But I think the story that I was sort of sharing some elements of before, which is we pay faster, we customize less, we leave more opportunity for innovation. We are a better client in so many ways. And there's a lot of work. Remember, $54 billion program before COVID meant that construction professionals all over the world had to take notice. So that was our strategy. It did get interrupted by the COVID crisis, when obviously you can't bring builders from foreign countries and
Right.
hither and yon.
Assuming we get past that, a lot of people became introduced to the MTA's project cost structure when the New York Times wrote a series of exposés on the way costs get run up. And we learned, among other things, that here a tunnel boring machine has 25 people on it, whereas in France there are 9 people on the tunnel boring machine, and that we pay 4 times more per mile of track constructed than they pay in London or in other Western European countries that have similarly complex, old city systems. So what I think a lot of people miss is that these wages and these rules are largely a function of contracts between private contractors and the union construction workers. They're not really within the MTA's control. But I'm not going to let you off the hook on that, because aren't there things that you could do to drive those efficiencies? And here's an analogy for you: like Walmart doesn't just buy what its suppliers sell, they squeeze their suppliers to become more efficient so they can lower prices, and they pass those price cuts on to consumers. Why can't you do that with your contractors and their unions?
Well, and it's a fair point. The MTA does not sit at the table in the negotiations between the contractors and the labor unions. But, we have conveyed to the contractors groups that we think that they should be listening to us about the issues that we think are urgent and important to address in their negotiations, and which will affect our willingness and our capability to do projects. So, Eric, what I would say is, again, we were working on this for a short time before COVID struck, but I think that we had a pretty good rapport with the employers associations. I would be wary, Eric, I would just be wary of, too primitive comparisons between our costs here and our costs in other places, in the costs in other places. I know that, there have been, some studies done of it. It's worth, you really need a very scientific apples to apples comparison, whether whether wages include the cost of health insurance in European cities which have health insurance. I mean, there are myriad factors. I'm not, trying to, push the issue aside, but it's a really complicated issue. And I think some of the things that I talked about earlier, which is how do we manage projects, how do we staff projects, have an equal impact on cost, as do our contractors' actual bid prices.
Well, I'm sure, it's going to take contributions from both sides. And I have heard that the unions have made some progress in terms of creating positions so that you can have lower skilled, lower paid people do lower skilled jobs. You don't have to pay like an electrician who's making $100 an hour to unload a truck. You can find someone else in the union who can unload the truck and have the electrician just do electrical work. So I'm hearing good things on that front. I do hope that pans out. I want to ask you about what you can get from the private sector in terms of transit improvements. There was a ribbon cutting recently at One Vanderbilt, a big new skyscraper in Midtown, and the mayor was there. And of course, everyone in government is very happy that SL Green is doing $220 million worth of transit improvements. Now, not every project can afford to do that kind of work, but you can do lower level things as well. Can you tell us how that is going and whether we're likely to see more of that?
Yeah, I mean, the project you're referring to, the One Vanderbilt project at 42nd, directly west of Grand Central Station, 42nd and Vanderbilt, was a huge project. And as you said, it paid for over $200 million of transit improvements, both new entrances to Grand Central that directly feed into the Grand Central concourses, which would be great because we're always trying to spread out, give people more, more access and a smoother flow. But also some improvements that were done to the existing subway station mezzanine, which I doubled down on, because if you go to the Grand Central subway station, historically chaotic and pretty dilapidated, you will see a brand new kind of passenger environment on the subway mezzanine, brand new escalators as well in the busiest single entrance to our subway system. Some of that was private. We worked with them. We added to the scope of that, and really changing that experience in the Grand Central subway station. There are other projects that are in the same area, the so-called East Midtown rezoning area around Grand Central, that are going to have to make significant investments. There's a project that is redeveloping what's currently the Hyatt, known as the Commodore project. That's one that we're working with. JP Morgan Chase, although they're not technically East Midtown rezoning site, is also making major transit investments. And the old MTA headquarters, 45th and Madison, has been sold. We've got a deal pending with Boston Properties for them to rebuild to pay a lot of money for the ground, but also to make investments in new entrances to Grand Central. So that idea of investments around Grand Central is really taking hold. But in the rest of the system, we really do need to figure out how to do what the rest of the world is doing, which is so-called value capture. When you're improving transit systems, you're creating great value for everybody who owns the real estate in the area. And some of that value could be captured and used in the form of special assessments or taxes, could be used to fund the investments so that the real estate gets the great pop in value, but the public also gets better mass transit. We don't have that capacity right now, because value capture, all of those taxes that you would want to use for value capture are owned by the city of New York and the MTA's state agency. So we have to find a mechanism to do that.
We have a mechanism. The number 7 subway extension to the west side used that, right? The future property tax increases from the enhanced value that station provided was used to fund the bonds that paid for that. Was a $2.4 billion project, but that's the only time we've seen that happen. So I don't know why that hasn't been repeated since then.
Well, that was a case where the city of New York, and it was the Bloomberg administration, they were pretty visionary about how to open up and develop the west side of Manhattan. The city of New York, of its own initiative, came to the table with that idea of value capture that would fund an MTA project. But the MTA can't duplicate that on its own, because it has to be an initiative of the city of New York, and those, obviously the city is looking after its own pocketbook. So whether it's probably after COVID, but we have to find a way to engage in value capture, because that's a way all over the world that people are building great infrastructure, and we're not doing it in New York.
Can you, from what you said before, it sounds like expansion of the system is in great jeopardy if we don't get federal funding in tens of billions of dollars from Washington. What about the Second Avenue subway? That's the big one. I assume East Side Access and projects that are underway are going to be finished, but Second Avenue subway is a phased project, and phase 2, which we've been waiting for I don't know, 100 years or so, isn't that in jeopardy now?
Well, the reason that the Second Avenue subway is in jeopardy is that the federal government, just like they're sitting on our application to move forward with congestion pricing, not responding, in any way that would allow the process to go forward. They're also been sitting for over a year. They've been sitting on our application for, federal grant for the Second Avenue subway phase 2. That is the project that would take the 2nd Avenue subway from its current terminus at 96th and 2nd Avenue, up 2nd Avenue, then across to 125th and Park, where it would connect with obviously the number 4, 5, and 6 subway at 125th and Lexington, but also with Metro North's 125th Street station. So it would be a huge benefit in terms of connecting people in Harlem and East Harlem to jobs and education and opportunity and everything New York has to offer. And as Erik says, that project, we promised 2nd Avenue subway starting in the 1930s when they were knocking down the 2nd and 3rd Avenue elevated trains. So, it's overdue. You have a community that's more transit dependent than any other part of the city of New York based on the rates of car ownership. And it's really overdue. We're waiting for the feds to take action. And when they do, I hope that project will move forward.
Well, I certainly do. And one of our viewers has asked about the Metro North, which you mentioned, the 125th Street station, but you also have 4 Metro North stations planned for the Bronx. Are those all on hold until you can get this funding situation straightened out?
Listen, I think since the COVID crisis hit and put the MTA capital program in jeopardy financially, we've been limiting our new commitments to a specific group of projects. One is in-house projects where we have to pay the workforce. It's track and other work in the system, capital projects, but there are people, so we have to pay them on the operating budget of capital project. So we have our budget, so we must get that work done. The other is federally funded projects where we have use it or lose it federal money. The final category is accelerations, which were just one-time opportunities to use the low ridership, the period of low ridership to get a lot more work done. And that was a very low cost increment. I think that only cost us $75 million. So we're really not moving anything new forward until the dust settles on the capital program and the financial crisis that COVID has triggered.
What about I think you're also in charge of the retail operations that you have at MTA. You have a lot of retail tenants. You have restaurants, you have stores in your high traffic locations. And we obviously they're in trouble, just like retailers everywhere are in trouble. How have you managed that? Are you giving lots of rent breaks? Are we at the litigation stage yet? Like, what is your retail operation looking like now?
I think, honestly, the MTA has, views its retail both as a source of revenue. We're obligated, obviously, to get the market value so we can support the system, right? We need that revenue so we can run trains and build projects. But we also view it as amenities for our customers. In many cases, it's small operations that are dependent on ridership. So we are looking, and we deferred rent for many of our tenants during the initial period of COVID, and we're looking again at what's the right way to handle the pandemic economically. The MTA, we want to be in lockstep with what's going on in the marketplace. So we've spent some time evaluating, how landlords in the private sector are handling all this uncertainty, and we're going to try to develop a plan that will keep us in market, so to speak, for our retail tenants. We value them. They're part of the success of the New York passenger experience, but we also have to be responsible to our ultimate customer, the taxpayers.
Right. Is that a significant amount of revenue usually for you?
I mean, it's 70, in $50 to $100 million a year, in general terms.
Right. So nothing, but relative to the size of your budget, not a huge amount, but certainly a very visible part. And I'm sure you don't want empty stores for your customers who are walking through these stations. What's on the drawing board? We have seen quite a few real estate deals that surprise me, in the private sector, like new hotel projects. And I think to myself, why would anyone build a hotel now? The industry's, in the tank. But real estate people tend to look 3 or 4 years out, or 5 years, or 10 years out. So I would imagine that the MTA has to do a little bit of that as well. I mean, is it realistic that in our lifetime we might see the one train brought, under the harbor to Red Hook, or, the mayor at one point wanted to take the 3 train in Brooklyn and extend it farther into Brooklyn. There's a fabulous project that would, connect 3 different boroughs using an old freight line that the Regional Plan Association has been advancing for years. Like, are these not, should we just drop these fantasies, or do you think we could maybe see some progress on these, once we get past this pandemic?
I do, and I think that we have to. You're absolutely right, Eric. We have to plan for the region's future. We have to plan for growth. I mean, remember, we're in the middle of this terrible pandemic and all the impacts to our economy and our public health situation, and to individuals. But many of us I grew up in New York. I grew up in New York in the 70s, and we lived through 9/11. We lived through Superstorm Sandy. We lived through the financial crisis. Larry Silverstein always said, "Don't bet against New York." He took the long view, and it's always borne out. So I do think you're right that we have to plan for the future of New York and what it's going to need to prosper and grow in terms of its mass transit and its public infrastructure. The projects that you made reference to are serious candidates for evaluation. The Bay Ridge Line, which runs from the Brooklyn waterfront up to Fresh Pond in Queens and cuts across, I think a dozen different subway lines, which are kind of on the hub and spoke system coming into Manhattan. That would be obviously an appealing project. The Utica Avenue extension, they're all being studied. What I'm trying to do is to make sure that those studies become, that we're doing it systematically so that you can compare the economic value and the return on investment, transportation-wise, economic development-wise, of different investment options, so that when the crisis passes and the world comes back to normal, we do have some basis of choosing among how we want to spend big money in the future. But one that the governor has really emphasized is Penn Station. We have, at the end of this year, the governor is going to be opening Moynihan Station, the post office, the new train station, the post office. We are building a new entrance to Penn Station, which will allow people not to have to go through that rabbit warren of staircases and escalators that you now enter to go into the station from 7th Avenue. We're widening the Long Island Railroad corridor. We're talking to Amtrak and New Jersey Transit about significantly upgrading Penn Station. And then the governor is emphasizing the need to expand Penn Station so we can have more tracks and platforms and serve more trains, because our future requires more commuting capacity as we grow. And he's emphasizing not just the passenger experience above grade, but actually the ability to run more trains. So he announced that, and we have started to work with Amtrak and NJT on it. But obviously, all of these, mega projects have to be, put in somewhat in alignment time-wise with the financial solutions that we're looking from Washington to provide.
We only have about 5 minutes left, and so Penn Station is certainly, that was going to be my next topic. You mentioned Grand Central, and it was a little aging and tired and needed that sort of freshening up, but Grand Central is magnificent compared to Penn Station. I never had an issue with Grand Central because I know what Penn is like, and Penn is just like the worst. But I would imagine that there is so much potential value to be gained by the real estate right around it, that value capture would be a great way to fund some of those projects. Vornado, owns, billions of dollars worth of real estate right around Penn Station. There are other private landlords who would benefit from a better Penn Station. What's the plan for getting the private sector to contribute to the Penn Station upgrades?
Sure. So just for point of clarification, when I talked about Grand Central, I was talking about the subway station underneath Grand Central Terminal. That's where we have made investments that I think dramatically improve the customer circulation areas and the access to the platforms, which we've added lots of stairways and escalators. But to your point about Penn, the governor announced that we are engaged in what they call a general project plan, which is when the state takes over zoning authority and figures out a plan to, in effect, create a new land use regime for an area. It was done, for Times Square, and it's been done for some other major areas. And the ESDC, the New York State Economic Development Agency, is engaged in that right now. And you're right, Eric. We don't know the specifics yet, but it will include provision for any additional air rights or development rights to be paid for, just like the city's East Midtown rezoning setup, so that to generate money for the redevelopment of Penn Station. So the specifics of what will be asked for and proposed as part of that general project plan by ESDC are still a work in progress from what I understand. But you're right, that will be a so-called value capture opportunity to put it to work for a big change at Penn Station.
And you're still planning to do a new terminal across the street on the south end of the station, where you'd have to buy up, maybe condemn a whole lot of land if you can't buy it. There's a whole city block there. What's happening with that south terminal idea?
Well, that is what I was referring to earlier, which is the idea that we have to build more tracks and platforms to expand the train capacity of Penn. You're exactly right. That the governor's proposal, which we are moving forward to design together with NJT and Amtrak, is that we locate those 8 new tracks underneath what they call Block 780, the block between 7th and 8th Avenue, 30th to 31st Street, which is directly south of existing Penn Station. So you would have to acquire that land and demolish, excavate, and create a new underground transit facility, but also entrances above. Whether it will be a station or exactly how it'll be configured, TBD, because the main point is that the above grade should be real estate, the privately developed real estate, so that you have the opportunity to generate income to pay for the station.
Mm-hmm. Well, that all sounds great. I'm not going to ask you whether we're going to rebuild the magnificent Penn Station that we used to have there, because I realize, the government has decided what he's going to do, and ultimately, this is his show, what happens at Penn, and he has decided not to rebuild, to entirely, take Madison Square Garden out of the way and rebuild the whole station. Or you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it looks like you're working under the assumption the garden will stay there and you'll just work around it and underneath it.
I think that, truthfully, we can really dramatically improve existing Penn Station. It's not up to me, whether Madison Square Garden stays or goes. But I can tell you, we have been doing a master plan. This was announced some time ago for the renovation of existing Penn Station. As always, it's a joint project with Amtrak and New Jersey Transit. And that effort is yielding some ideas about how you could dramatically improve the passenger experience and the functionality of the existing Penn Station, which, as you said, is everybody agrees is one of the worst places, the worst major transit facilities in the city, certainly maybe in the country. So we're already making huge investments to make it better. And there are opportunities, we think, once Amtrak leaves to go across the street to Moynihan Station in the post office, to really upgrade that facility even more for everybody's use.
Well, we're going to have to leave it on that note. We've covered a tremendous amount of ground here. I want to thank you, Janno Lieber, head of the MTA's whole construction operation. I wish you the best as far as getting that money from Washington and all the other agreements you have to work out. So thank you again for joining us. To our viewers, we have one more TRD Talks coming up a week from today. We're going to talk to Rick Cotton, the Executive Director of the Port Authority, another massive public agency. And we're going to find out what he's up to with his many billions of dollars and COVID problems as well. So thank you to Janno Lieber and to the MTA. Thanks to everyone for watching today, and we'll see you next week.